Module 3.1, where we are going to be talking about Bearcat Incorporated, which is this fictional manufacturing company in the northeastern United States. So the way this is going to work tonight is we're going to spend just a few minutes having kind of a brief discussion and overview about the Bearcat case. And you're going to need to read the story that's been uploaded to Blackboard. You'll have a few minutes to do that in just a moment. So don't worry about reading it right now. Just kind of keep up with what we're doing in real time. And in this process, we're going to be creating this Bearcat ERD, which is going to make up 20% of the exam readiness quiz grade. And then after completing the ERD, we're going to have some questions, which will make up the other 80% of the ERQ. Let's do it. So the story about Bearcat Incorporated really has kind of a lot going on. So one thing that we've already talked about in a couple of examples is that Bearcat has plants and plants undertake projects, right? We've seen this small example several times, but Bearcat also has, of course, employees that work in these plants and that work on these projects. And these employees may or may not be managers, and they may or may not have managers, and employees may or may not have dependents like children or people that they care for, and those dependents may or may not have hobbies. And Bearcat's kind of a cool company in that they organize like softball games and skating outings and things like that your dependents, that your kids can like come do, right? So these dependents may or may not participate in those types of activities. And then Bearcat also has a credit union, which employees can participate in and dependents can participate in, but don't have to. And you can have either individual or joint accounts or both, right? So there's a lot going on with this company that we're going to try to capture in our model. And by the end of the night, we are going to have created a model that looks like this, right? Which seems like a lot. I know, because we just had a few little boxes and diamonds before. And now this is like a huge mess of stuff. But we're going to break it down, right? And part of what we need to learn tonight is about decomposing a problem, right? And maybe you've seen these types of learn to draw things before, where it's like, you know, you want to draw this fancy looking house. So you start with a circle and then another circle, and then we're going to draw a little line going off to the side or whatever. But that's a great way to approach a problem like this. But I think often when we see some, big IS, project or requirements or whatever like this, we kind of skip over it and we go, all right, I'm going to start with the circle, I'm going to start with the circle, and then I'm just going to freak out and kind of try to do the whole thing at once, right? And it is easy to be overwhelmed like that. But if we take this complex problem and we break it down into these smaller, simpler steps, and we just complete a small piece and another small piece and another small piece, and then kind of stitch that together, we can overcome some pretty big things, right? We can solve some pretty complex problems. And this isn't just an idea in database design or even in IS, right? You can apply this idea of decomposing big problems to almost any aspect of your life. So, hopefully this will be a very enriching night for all of us. So we're going to decompose this big problem and attack it that way. But we're going to start by identifying our attributes and our entities. And there's kind of two different approaches we might take here. One, the synthesis approach would be to read through the story and just identify every little thing that you might think might be a data element, or might be an attribute, or might be an entity. Just write down everything you see and kind of group them together in a way that makes sense. And we're going to think that these clusters of attributes probably are going to be entities, right? And we might tweak them a little bit along the way. But this is one approach, would be to find every, individual data element and write them down and see how they cluster together. Or another approach, and this is what we've done a couple of times in class so far, we call the analysis approach, which is to identify all of our nouns and underline them, and nouns are going to correspond with either entities or attributes, and then find our verbs, and verbs generally are going to be the relationships between entities, right? So two different approaches. Neither one is right or wrong or better or worse, just might make more sense to you or for a particular problem or whatever. And maybe you'll use kind of a hybrid approach here, right? But we need to identify our entities, our attributes, our relationships, and no matter what you do have to be a little bit careful because not everything that is mentioned in the story, not every noun, not every verb, not every discernible data element is actually going to be important to the story, right? So we might wind up throwing out some things as we progress through our kind of iterative process, okay? So at this point, I want you guys to take 5 minutes and find the PDF that was on Blackboard, and it's about a page long and has 5 little paragraphs labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Take a 5 minutes to read through that and just make note of what entities, attributes, and relationships you see. And don't worry about being perfect right now because, as I've mentioned, this is an iterative process, so we'll kind of refine this as we go. All right, so that's been about 5 minutes, and if you didn't get all the way through the story, that's fine too. But if somebody wants to let me know, maybe a couple of entities that you identified in the story.
There are employees, supervisors, managers.
Okay. Employees, projects.
Supervisor.
I heard someone say managers.
Plants.
Plants, yeah, we've talked about plants already. That's good.
Supervisors.
Supervisors.
Habbies.
Dependents.
Hobbies.
BCU account.
BCU accounts, yeah.
Hobbies.
Hobbies. Employees, projects, managers, plants, supervisors, dependents, BCU accounts, and hobbies. Anything else?
Would the HR department be an entity?
HR department, that's a good question. It does mention the HR department, but then doesn't really say much about it other than that it just exists. So, you know, if the story expanded out more, I think that would be something that could be there. I don't know that we have much call for it in the current story, but that's a good eye. One thing I'll ask about here, managers and supervisors, those are really kind of the same thing, right? I think just maybe 2 words for the same thing, but even above and beyond that, is a manager really different than an employee, or is it just another employee that happens to manage other employees? Should we model these separately, or maybe is just manager a special type of employee? Yeah, I think they may be a special type of employee that have a relationship with other employees that they manage them.
But they also have a relationship with the plant because if the plant was closed, the manager goes to another plant as a normal employee.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And that's a good point, that if the manager was its own type of entity and then the plant closed and they went to a different plant and they were no longer a manager, well, then you've got to like move them from that manager entity to an employee entity. Yeah, it complicates things a lot. So we'll see how we can model that. But I think these 6 things we have here, employee, projects, plants, dependents, BCU accounts, and hobbies, I think this is going to have us in a good place. So what we're going to do is first start by developing this kind of presentation layer ER model. And we're going to divide the story up into these meaningful chunks, which is what I've already done, the ones that are labeled 1 through 5, and identify the entities, the relationships, our cardinality, and participation constraints, and then just kind of iterate through the story and make sure that we are capturing everything, okay? So the stories are how plants and projects are related, how employees are related to plants and projects, how employees and supervisors are related, how employees and dependents are related, how how employees and dependents are related to these BCU accounts, and how dependents and hobbies are related. So, what you should have downloaded along with this story right here is this PDF file that has some kind of empty ER diagrams. And normally in a face-to-face class, I would have this printed out and you would just write the words in there. But what I think is going to make more sense for tonight is you can kind of use this as a guide to just draw these on, a regular sheet of paper that you can take a picture of and upload to Blackboard. Or if you want to create these in PowerPoint or Visio or something, you could do that. But we're going to be moving fairly quickly, so that might be too time consuming, but whatever makes sense for you and helps you learn the best. So we're going to start with story number 1 here. So Bearcat Incorporated is a manufacturing company with several plants in the northeastern United States. So we talked about how we need to kind of watch out and make sure that we're not capturing things in our model that aren't really useful and helping, what we need to capture in the database. Does this first little section of the story here really tell us anything that we need to capture in our data model? It's a company, it has plants. We're going to talk about plants more later. I don't think this is really super useful, so we might not need to spend too much time on that. And then this last part here, if a plant is closed down, the projects undertaken by that plant cannot be canceled. They must be temporarily removed to allow the project to be transferred to another plant. What we're interested in right now are really just our entities and relationships. And what is this talking about?
Deletion rules.
Yeah, these are our deletion constraints. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. What's really important right now is this story in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and put you guys into your breakout groups, and we're going to spend just about 3 minutes on this one, and then we're going to come back and discuss how we need to fill this in. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms, join that, and in 3 minutes we'll be back here. All right, we're back. And normally I'm able to walk around the room and kind of eavesdrop and hear how these conversations are going. I can't really do that very effectively now, but hopefully they all went well. And what are the entities that we have identified here?
Plants and project.
Plants and projects, right? So probably wound up with something like this: plant and project. And my handwriting is not the best, and writing on tablets isn't the easiest. But then we see some verbs here, and there's a couple of different words that are used, like leading and undertake and associated with. I like the word undertake, so I'm going to say plants, undertake, projects. So we got our entities, we got our relationship, and then we also had some sentences here that describe our participation and cardinality. So for example, right here, a certain plant might be associated with several projects. Okay, so a plant can have several projects. So what can we say about the cardinality of our plant entity? It's many, right? The options are either one or many. So since a plant can have many projects, we're going to write our either M or N on the other side of this relationship. So a plant undertakes a maximum of many projects. And then in this next part, a project is always under the control of just one plant. So what can we say about the cardinality of project?
One.
Which we're going to represent with the 1 right there. And it's always under the control of just one plant. So could a project ever not have a plant?
No.
Project is always going to be associated with a plant, meaning it has mandatory or total participation, which we're going to represent with this dash right here. And then finally, some plants do not undertake any projects at all. So that means the participation of plant is
0.
Optional or partial, either way, which we represent with a circle right there. Okay, so we should have wound up with a diagram that looks something like this. Okay, so that's story 1, we've made some progress. In story 2, we're talking about employees and their relationships with plants and their relationships with projects. So this one is a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to stick you in the breakout rooms for about 7 minutes, and then we will be back here. So see you guys in 7 minutes. All right, so I believe we are back. These breakout rooms working out okay? Things are going all right? Excellent. So this time we're only adding one entity, but we have quite a few relationships we're talking about. What is the one entity that we're interested in here?
Employee.
Employees.
Right, employees. And employees are in 2 different relationships with plants and then one with projects. So let's start with this employees work in plants. So I'm just going to write work in right here. And it says employees work in plants and each employee works in only one plant. So this is one of those things that's not 100% clear, right? We would document this and then maybe go back and double check with the business, but I'm reading this not as some employees work in plants or employees might work in plants, but that employees definitely have to work in a plant. That's kind of an assumption I'm making, but I think it's a pretty good one, right? And an employee works in only one plant. So what does this say about the participation and the cardinality of employees in this work-in relationship? What's our participation constraint?
Mandatory.
Yeah, it's mandatory.
Work in one plant.
Work in a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 1. So we have a cardinality of 1. And then it says a plant may have many employees, right? So that's speaking of the cardinality for plant, but must have at least 100 employees in order to exist. And we can't really represent a minimum number of employees in this type of diagram, but if it has to be at least 100, well, it also has to be at least 1. So I'm going to say plant has mandatory participation. Now, in our next story here, we're talking about the managerial relationship between employees and plants. So I'm going to say employee manages a plant. So it says every plant is managed by an employee who works in the same plant. So every plant is managed by an employee. So it sounds like a plant has to have an employee and only one employee managing it at that. So this sounds to me like plant has mandatory participation and a cardinality of 1. It's going to have exactly one employee managing it. Now, are all employees managers?
No.
No. Every employee is not a plant manager, so that means employee has optional participation in this relationship. An employee doesn't have to be a manager of a plant. That makes a lot of sense. Nor can an employee manage more than one plant, right? Which means the cardinality of employee in this relationship is
1 to 1.
Well, the cardinality of employee is just 1. The cardinality of this manager's relationship, we would say, is it's a 1-to-1 relationship, right? So good.
Professor, I got a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, on the comment that 1-to-1, one manager to one plant, and the one plant can only have one manager.
Right.
I'm not sure if that's clear though. You can have 2 managers that manages one plant in shift. You know, maybe you got the night shift, you got the morning shift, kind of like that.
Right.
The paragraph doesn't really clearly states that you have to have one manager.
That's absolutely correct. And that's one of those things that once we draw this diagram and now we go back to our business person, we say, okay, we're making the assumption that a plant has only one manager. Maybe that's true, or maybe they go, oh, no, actually I meant only one manager per shift, right? And then we would have to go back and change the diagram to make this a one-to-many relationship. But this gives us the opportunity to catch something like that before we actually build the database. So yeah, great call on that. You know, I'm reading it, by an employee, like maybe it's a singular, but yeah, I can definitely see where that could be a possibility. And that's what we're trying to kind of suss out here. So good eye. But for now, let's keep it a one-to-one. And then finally, this third paragraph, we're talking about not employees and plants, but employees and projects. So some employees are assigned to work on projects. So I'm going to say this relationship is assigned, okay? And this says some employees, which makes me think it's not all employees, right? You might be an employee and not be assigned to a project because maybe you're like the CEO, right? Or maybe you're the janitor, right? You're an employee, but you're not doing project work. So that word some makes me think that employees have optional participation in this relationship. And in some cases might be assigned to work on several projects, right? So that means the cardinality for employee is
Multiple.
Many.
yeah, many, right? So we're going to represent that with either an M or an N here across from employees. For a project to exist, it must have at least one employee assigned to it. So project is going to have mandatory participation. And a project might need several employees depending on its size and scope. So the cardinality of project is going to be many, which we'll represent with an N right there. So we have a many-to-many relationship between employees and the projects that they are assigned to. Right, so pretty it up, and it should look something like that. All good so far? All right, so we have a little bit smaller story coming up here where we talk about this supervisory relationship between employees and other employees. So we're going to set aside about 3 minutes for our breakout groups this time, and then we'll come back and discuss. All right, I believe we are all back, and we have a really interesting story this time where we talk about employees supervising other employees. So we only have one entity in this story, but it's in a relationship with itself. So I believe our entity is going to be employee, and employees can supervise other employees. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here. And we're going to be able to read this in two directions, and this can be a little bit confusing, right? Because you've got, on the one hand, employee supervises other employees, right? But then in the other direction, it is employees are supervised by some other employee, right? So we're going to read this in two different directions. And okay, let's just start over. There we go. So we've got our employees, and they are going to be supervising other employees. So it says some employees supervise other employees. So we're talking about employees supervising employees, not all employees are a supervisor, right? So we have optional participation in this direction. Some employees supervise other employees, but all employees need not be supervised. So not all employees have a supervisor either. So when we go in the other direction, an employee is going to be supervised by a minimum of 0 other employees. So in both directions, we have optional participation. The employees that are supervised by just one employee. So an employee is supervised by a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1 employees. So you either don't have a supervisor or you have exactly one supervisor. And then an employee may be a supervisor of several employees or many employees, but no more than 20. Okay, so we could just put an M here for the cardinality, but we earlier in class talked about capturing the maximum cardinality. And so even in this diagram, we can do that. And instead of a many, we could put a 20 here, right? We couldn't really capture that minimum of 100 employees working in a plant, but we can capture this maximum of supervising 20 employees. Okay, and then this next part here, this is talking again about our deletion constraints. So we're not going to be too worried about that at this point. Okay, so this is what our diagram should look like here in this unary or recursive relationship. Make sense? Excellent. So now we can kind of start piecing together what we have done so far, right? And now we have something that's kind of bigger than any individual element we've done so far, right? So we had our first story here about plants and projects, and then our second story here about how employees are related to plants and employees are related to projects, and then our third story here about how employees supervise other employees. So now we're getting this bigger story than any individual thing we've done so far, which is kind of cool. All right, story 4, we're talking about employees and dependents and Bearcat credit union accounts. And again, this is going to be a pretty big one, so we're going to spend 7 minutes in our breakout groups and then come back and discuss. So rooms are opening now, and see you guys in 7 minutes. All right, welcome back. So now we're talking about employees and their dependents and their credit union accounts and things like that. So let's go ahead and start just right here. What is the entity that goes in this box?
The dependent entity.
That's the dependent. All right. And what can we say is special about this dependent entity?
It's a weak entity.
It is a weak entity, right? And we know that because it's got this double box around it. And then the double diamond means this is an identifying relationship. So we're not going to have any dependents in our database that aren't dependents of an employee that works in our company, right? That wouldn't make sense, just have random people in there. So the way this is described, I think in the second page of the handout, maybe a little further than we're looking at right now, is that dependents are identified by the employee that they are a dependent of. So that's why it's a weak entity there. But let's go ahead and look at our structural constraints here. And one other thing that I'll point out is I know the words that I'm writing for these relationships are not always matching what's actually in the presentation. And the words that are in the relationships really don't have any strict technical meaning. Now, typically, we'll use the names of the entities to correspond to the tables in our database, but we don't really have names for the relationships in our database. So not a huge deal what we put for the names of the relationships. But reading this story, this says some employees may have several dependents. Okay, so some employees, that says to me that the cardinality of employee in this relationship is optional, right? So not all employees have a dependent, but they may have several dependents if they have a dependent. Okay, so they have optional participation, but they're going to have a cardinality of many. And in order to be a dependent, you have to have an employee you're associated with. So dependent is going to have mandatory participation. And they've got this really weird rule right here. Bearcat Incorporated does not allow both husband and wife to be an employee of the company. I don't know how that gets through HR, but you know, whatever. That's the business rule they have in place. But effectively what that means is a dependent can only be a dependent of a maximum of one employee, right? Can only be a dependent of one employee at a time. So dependent is going to have a cardinality of 1. So we have a one-to-many relationship. And then what's this other entity sitting down here?
BCU account?
Yeah, this is our BCU account, our Bearcat Credit Union account. And a credit union is kind of like a bank, right? So this is a credit union account where employees and or their dependents can deposit money either in an individual account or a joint account. So I'm going to call this like owns employee, and this is going to be owns dependent. So they offer it as a service to their employee. An employee is not required to become a member of the Bearcat Credit Union. Okay, so that says to me that an employee has optional participation in this relationship. However, most employees and some of their dependents have accounts with BCUs. So since it's some of the dependents, not all of the dependents, that says to me the dependents also have optional participation in this relationship. Some BCU accounts are individual accounts, and others are joint accounts held by an employee and his or her dependent. Okay, so now this seems like this is talking about the cardinality. So can an employee have more than one BCU account?
Yes.
Yeah, because they can have their individual account and they can have a joint account with their dependent. So an employee has between 0 and many BCU accounts. And same thing for a dependent. They can have an individual account and they can also have their joint account with their employee that they're a dependent of. So they also have a cardinality of many. Every BCU account must belong to at least one employee or a dependent, and each joint account must involve no more than one employee and no more than one of his or her dependents. Okay, so does every BCU account belong to an employee?
No.
No, because it could belong to a dependent, right? So when we're looking at this relationship, the BCU account and employees, BCU account has optional participation in this relationship because the BCU account might be owned by a dependent, okay? And same thing over here, BCU account is going to have optional participation in this relationship because the BCU account could be owned by an employee, okay? But each joint account must involve no more than one employee and no more than one of his or her dependents. And somewhere, if you read through here, it's going to indicate that a BCU account is owned by a maximum of one employee. So as far as cardinality goes, a BCU account is going to be owned by a minimum of 0, but a maximum of one employee, and a minimum of 0 and a maximum of one dependent. Okay, so a lot of optional participation here and kind of one-to-many relationships between our employees and our dependents. So a lot to pick through there. But now we've talked about employees, plants, projects, employees supervising employees, having dependents, having BCU accounts, and we can just kind of keep tacking all this together. And man, we're getting somewhere, right? We've got kind of a lot. So we're to our fifth and final story where we're talking about dependents and the hobbies that they engage in. So this is our final diagram, and actually I think it would make this easier to know that this entity is employees and employees have dependents, and we're just adding one more entity to this story that we've already talked about. So we're going to leave our breakout rooms open for about 3 minutes this time because it's a shorter story, and then we'll come back and discuss. So see you guys momentarily. All right, so that's our last breakout room for a couple of minutes, although we will revisit them in a couple of slides. But what is the one entity that we are adding to our diagram now?
Hobbies.
Hobbies.
Hobbies, right? And dependents, I think participate in hobbies is probably a good thing to call this relationship. So it says, let's see, dependents need not have a hobby, but some dependents may have several hobbies. So this is speaking of the participation and cardinality of dependents, right? So dependents don't have to have a hobby, so they have optional participation in our relationship. But if they do a hobby, they might actually do a lot of hobbies, meaning their cardinality is going to be many. Because some hobbies are not as popular as others, every hobby does not have to have a participant, right? So hobby is going to have optional participation in this relationship because not all hobbies are going to have people doing them. But do we think it would make sense that multiple dependents could participate in a single hobby?
Yes.
I don't know, hobbies like softball aren't going to be much fun if you only let one dependent do them. So I believe what we have here would be a many-to-many relationship between dependents and hobbies, right? So it's going to look something like this. All right, so now we can take this put it all together, and we are getting a lot closer to where we said we were going to be by the end of the night. I think things are looking pretty good. But I'll point out one problem here. If we read the story a little bit more closely, where we're talking about BCU accounts and the dependents and employees, this idea right here that some BCU accounts are individual accounts and others are joint accounts held by an employee and his or her dependent. Every BCU account must belong to at least one employee or a dependent. Each joint account must involve no more than one employee and no more than one of his or her dependents. Okay? Every BCU account must belong to at least one employee or a dependent. Okay? Does a BCU account have to belong to an employee? No, it has optional participation here. Does a BCU account have to belong to a dependent? No, we have optional participation here. So this is actually causing a problem because the way this is modeled, we could have some weird situation where a BCU account is not in this relationship and it's also not in this relationship, and that violates this business rule. Okay? So that's a problem, and we're going to solve that by using this new grammar that we introduced earlier, either the exclusive arc, the inclusive arc, or this either both arc. Okay? So if we were to put the exclusive arc here, this means that joint accounts would not be permitted. The BCU account is either in this relationship or it's in this relationship, but not both. Okay, so that doesn't really fix our problem. If we use the inclusive arc with the little dots on the end instead of the arrows on the end, that would mean that the BCU account has to participate in both of these relationships if it participates in either one, which would mean we can have joint accounts but not individual accounts, right? So that's also no good. This either both arc, though, means that the BCU account has to participate in either this relationship or in this relationship, or it could participate in both relationships. Okay, so this actually fixes our problem and captures all of the business requirements. So the either both arc kind of solves this problem.